Welcome to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. Legal issues simplified through real client stories and real-world experiences. Creating simplicity in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to another episode of Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd.
Thanks, Brad. As a business and healthcare law firm, we're often immersed in the heavy details of a particular issue or project. It's beneficial, if not mandatory, to ever so often take a step back and evaluate the bigger picture. This season's theme is Zoom Out. We've all been stuck in the life of a global pandemic. So today, we take a step back and look at how the issue we discussed will be impacted in our new normal. Brad, today's story is a tragic story of a surgeon who had to stop surgery suddenly. The impact it had on his practice, his partners, and their insurance was quite the gripping and sad story.
Yeah, totally. It was a shock for all of us who were involved with this story. You know, when we were preparing for today's episode, you and I started having a sidebar, and we started talking about the stories that we thought of about all these amazing people, though, that we have met who have suffered some type of disabilities through these nonprofit organizations that we support.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, and so for our audience benefit, we support several different nonprofits. You've heard us talk about some of their in other episodes maybe, but there's some inspiring stories about these individuals who've just had to confront some really tragic disabilities.
Okay, Brad, I'll bite. You want to tell one of these, don't you?
I do, and unfortunately I have a plethora of them. But this one, you and I are kind of talking about it, and you remember the story a little bit. But a couple years back, actually about 9 years ago now, I met a gentleman who's now considered a good friend, Jacob Schick. I met him through an organization called Carry the Load.
Yeah. As a reminder, we did an entire podcast with two Navy SEALs who started Carry the Load in May of the season.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Michael. So Jacob Schick, and everyone who knows Jacob calls him Jake. He's a third-generation combat Marine. While on deployment in 2004 in Iraq, his vehicle went over a triple-stack mine that detonated. And as Jake tells it, God has a sense of humor because he remembers every aspect of the explosion. Now, you have to understand, unlike Birdman, who was also blown up in Iraq, who was just caught on fire, and I say just because when you hear about Jake suffered massive damage to his body. His fractures all over his left leg, left arm, right arm, multiple skin and bone losses, burns all across his body at different levels, including his left hand and arm. And then, unfortunately, it was so severe they had to amputate below his left knee. Below his right knee. His whole leg had to be amputated. And so, while he's in the hospital in Germany, the doctor's like, "Hey, Jake, we're going to have to remove your left finger." Because it appears it's not going to be survivable. They're trying to go with, get much blood into the system that's working because, again, his hand had suffered such damage. And so when the doctor told Jake that they were going to remove his ring finger, he told the doctors that he would choke them out if they tried to do it.
Whoa. Well, I guess my follow-up question, Brad, is did the doctor decide not to get choked out? And I guess the follow-up to that follow-up is, why in the world did Jake not want his finger removed? Yeah,
and it's weird because, a lot of people were like, he had, unfortunately, lots of other parts of his body had been removed already. And so to answer your first question, the doctor did not get choked out because he did not remove Jake's left finger, his ring finger. And he had to undergo other operations while he was there. In fact, to date, he's undergone over 50 different operations. But later on, someone asked that same question, Michael, is, why didn't you let the doctor remove your ring finger? And he told him, one day I'm going to meet a woman who loves me for who I am, and I want to honor her by putting a ring on that finger, on my ring finger. And I just ran into Jake a few months ago and actually met his fiance. So congrats to you, Jake, for seeing the future that you could honor this nice woman that you met in the future.
Yes, and on a side note, Jake has done a lot with his life besides recently getting engaged.
This is true. So Jake's been really active in the nonprofit world. I met him through Carry the Load. He's now the CEO of One Tribe Foundation. Many of you might have known as 22 Kill. And he's been on a bunch of different TV shows, radio shows, podcasts, and you may have seen him in 2 movies with this guy named Bradley Cooper, An American Sniper, and A Star is Born. And besides that, Jake's a good guy, but he's also a phenomenal motivational speaker. And he said this that you and I actually thought about when we were putting this, talking about the script is physical pain reminds you you're alive. Mental pain tests your will to stay that way.
That's a cool story. You did good this time, Brad.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Way to go. And, when we were bantering, kind of getting ready for today and talking about how this today's story reminds us of some of our nonprofit stories, I also couldn't help but think of LEAP Global Missions.
Mm-hmm.
I've been on the board for LEAP for many years, and LEAP's a Christian medical mission organization that travels to hard-to-reach and war-torn countries to operate on children born with primarily craniofacial disabilities. And it's just the stories of how families are completely transformed because in their particular culture, the whole family and the kid will be outcast because they have that's how they treat people with disabilities. And when that is fixed by something in America that's a relatively straightforward operation many times, it completely changes everything for the future of that kid and their family. Yeah,
absolutely. You and I, we've had these amazing privilege to serve along these great nonprofit organizations. We've met great people, great leaders. And it may sound cliche, but it's not to us. We both get more out of these organizations than we'll ever be able to give.
So true. And one of those things that we get out of it is perspective. We have perspective in our day-to-day grind as business lawyers.
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing to write a buy-sell agreement.
Yep.
It's another to have a longtime client and friend suffer a disability and to work through not just the legal challenges, but the emotional impact that goes with that.
Yeah, Michael. So let's get into today's story.
Well, the story starts off with a random call from a longtime client that we'll call Dr. Kindness.
Byrd, let the audience know why are you calling him Dr. Kindness, although I do think I know the answer here.
Well, it's pretty intuitive, Brad, so you get a extra credit for being the smart guy today. Dr. Kindness was truly a super nice guy and a kind surgeon, and everyone who has ever worked with him or knows him personally thinks the world of him. So Dr. Kindness tells me he's going to retire immediately and wants to understand how to sell his shares in the practice.
Yeah, and for the audience, just to let you know, when we hear something like that someone's going to do immediate retirement, for us, it's normally some type of red flag. This is generally because a doctor is about to undergo or about to get investigated by somebody, or they're about to get kicked out of their practice. But unfortunately, Michael, on this side, this is not the case here.
No, Dr. Kindness had done nothing wrong. He had been diagnosed with Parkinson's, and that was going to prevent him from continuing to operate. The ripple effect caused a host of issues personally and professionally. For purposes of today's episode, we'll only concentrate on the professional impact, but make no mistake, the personal side of it was really difficult.
Absolutely. So one of the first actions we took was we requested all the applicable documents, including his employment agreement and his corporate documents, to understand what are the next steps we need to take to help him.
Okay. Well, Brad, I think we hit our first vocabulary word of the day. When most people hear the word corporate documents, I think they have a couple of thoughts race through their minds. Number one, I have no idea what a corporate document is, or they may just have died a little bit because we're using too much legal mumbo jumbo.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So, for those who you didn't kill and are still alive, corporate documents are a collection of kind of controlling and governing contracts between the owners and the officers and directors of a business entity. So this could be your formation documents that are formed to make your entity official with the state, or it could be your bylaws, which are the rules on how the entity is going to be run by the president and the secretary and the other officers and the directors. or it could be something even more personal, like a company agreement or a shareholders agreement that is the deal between the partners or the owners and on how things are going to work between them. And we did have an episode last season called Tear-Soaked Pizza, where we discussed the importance of having and understanding these documents.
Yeah, absolutely. And so thanks for the clarification. And for those of you who I did not kill, so we did review those documents. And what we pulled together for this particular case was the bylaws, the shareholders agreement, and the employment agreement to understand when he does elect to terminate, how is this going to affect, especially the fact that we want to look at the impact of the ownership when he terminates for disability.
So what did you learn?
Well, unfortunately, we ran into three major conflicts, and as we all know, that's never a good thing. The first conflict was the language in the employment agreement for termination for disability did not match how an owner could be terminated in a shareholder agreement. So I'll give you an example. In the shareholder agreement, it required the board approve that Dr. Kindness is deemed disabled for him to terminate his ownership, while the employment agreement required an independent physician determine that Dr. Kindness is disabled.
Yeah, this can become a really big deal. These different methodologies to determine whether there is a, quote, disability can be a huge source of conflict because it's not always presented like it is here with Dr. Kindness saying, I'm out, I've got to do it. A lot of times it can be much trickier. It could be, dementia, where the doctor thinks they're still fine, but they're not.
Yep.
And so the methodology to determine disability is like I said, it's a really big deal.
Yeah. So the second conflict, Michael, is that the practice and ultimately Dr. Kindness had bought some really phenomenal buy-sell disability insurance. However, the shareholder agreement had a purchase price for disability that did not actually match this disability policy. So let's give it again. The actual example is the disability policy provided for a $200,000 buyout, while the shareholder agreement only provided for a $5,000 buyout for Dr. Kindness, meaning contractually Dr. Kindness buyout for the practice was only going to be $5,000.
Yeah, and let's pause for a minute just for some context to talk about disability insurance, because that's a really important element when people are planning around this. And so it's important first to understand that there are actually different types of disability insurance. So what is probably intuitive, because most people are familiar with it at some level, is this personal disability insurance, and that's policy that you may have personally, that if you're disabled, there's going to be some monthly payment that will be paid to you during this disability. When we're talking about this, it's long-term disability.
Yep.
Another couple of types of disability insurance are more geared towards the business, the practice in this case. One is disability overhead insurance. And the idea there is, especially if you're a medical practice, if a doctor's disabled, you're taking some production off the table, but the bills don't change. And so you can purchase disability overhead insurance where the practice will receive a monthly amount to cover overhead because of that lost production. And then there is disability buyout insurance, and that is also in play in a story like ours with Dr. Kindness, where the doctor is going to be bought out because they're disabled from their ownership, and you can actually have insurance that will allow the insurance company to pay the money towards the buyout. So you can see, going back to your example, Brad, that you just gave, that you've been paying for years, or Dr. Kindness's practice, for a policy that would pay up to $200,000, yet his agreement with his partners was just to be paid $5,000.
Yeah, and that leads us right, Michael, perfectly into our third conflict, which is, as I said earlier, they had phenomenal disability insurance in general, but going back to your explanation, the second type of disability coverage they had was for the owner's overhead. So that was for the benefit of the actual practice. And for the practice, they were going to get paid $50,000 a month for expenses over the next 24 months if Dr. Kindness left for disability. However, the shareholder agreement, which he had signed, said that Dr. Kindness only had to cover 3 months of overhead.
Wow, same problem, different type of insurance. And again, contractually, Dr. Kindness only needed to cover his expenses for 3 months, but they've been paying for years for a really nice insurance product that would have covered it for an additional 21 months.
Yeah, and finally, for the audience, and some of you might know this, is the insurance typically only pays for what the obligations are required, and typically it's by these agreements. So we have this conflict that basically is going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars both to the practice and to Dr. Kindness.
Wow. Well, those are some major league conflicts. They paid huge sums of money for years to have great disability insurance, but they may not be able to even use the funds. Well, let's go to commercial, and when we get back, let's discuss these conflicts, how to catch them in the future, and, of course, learn about what happened to Dr. Kindness.
Many business owners use legal counsel as a last resort rather than as a proactive tool that can further their success. Why? For most, it's the fear of unknown legal costs. ByrdAdatto's Access Plus program makes it possible for you to get the ongoing legal assistance you need for one predictable monthly fee. That gives you unlimited phone and email access to the legal team, so you can receive feedback on legal concerns as they arise. Access Plus, a smarter, simpler way to access legal services. Find out more. Visit ByrdAdatto.com today.
Welcome back to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd. Now, Michael, this season is Zoom Out, and as part of our Zoom Out theme, we talk about that bigger picture. And, Michael, why do we have, we talked a lot about that corporate governance, but why do people have governing agreements? What's the purpose?
Well, think of it kind of in terms of a business marriage, and you're going to go into a marriage and have to work out how that marriage is going to work. And in the business world, that's understanding kind of some pretty major areas of how things are going to function. And as we always say, primarily the primary benefit of this is to make sure expectations are aligned.
Yep.
And so what we've kind of come to in our lessons from talking about this with clients and giving speeches is we talk about the 4 C's. Mm-hmm. And these, and the way we explain it, are the things that make or break a relationship among co-owners, things that have to be dealt with.
Yep.
First one is, the first C is cost, or if it's 2 people starting a business together, initial capital, but it's basically what money are you putting in and what are you getting in return for that? You want to make sure you're on the same page there.
Yes.
Second is compensation, and that's dealing with the thought of you now are an owner, but you also may be doing things on a day-to-day basis, working for this business, mm-hmm. and what is the compensation for that contribution? And sometimes it's a salary, sometimes it's based on your production. And even in some startups, the owners don't take a salary. They just say, we're going to be working to generate profits and we'll split them.
Yep.
But important thing to be on the same page
Yes.
about. Third is control. How are decisions going to be made? The governing documents will determine, what decisions are big enough that may require everyone to agree, and what decisions don't require that, because we're going to order some more staples. And I know have talked about that in prior episodes. Mm-hmm. And then the final, which of course is our subject for today, the final C is contingencies. And that's dealing with essentially the prenup. Like, what happens if there's a breakup? And the breakup isn't necessarily a breakup because we're not getting along, or I'm going to move to a different state and do something different. It could be a breakup forced by a disability because the person can no longer, do their job or contribute to, in this case, a medical practice, or it could even be, death.
Yeah. And, I've heard you talk about this before, so I'm going to quote you in this one. But when it comes to the C with the contingencies, you often say, well, this is the what if section of the discussion and the what if section of agreement. And these are important things to discuss. I've even said this is the prenup piece as to, and especially these professional entities, how are you going to treat each other? How's the medical practice going to treat someone? So kind of let's take again, zooming out here a little bit, focusing on, that's a business succession side. What are some of your thoughts of the things they need to concentrate on?
Well, as a starting point, you need to define, what are the things that would cause a buy-sell or a purchase of the practice? What are the
Triggers.
What are the what-ifs?
Yeah, the what-ifs.
We call them trigger events
Right.
in the contracts. And so, I mentioned them a little bit already. One would be death or disability.
Mm-hmm.
One would be, or broadly, a breakup. It may be, an amicable one where someone's going to go and do something different or relocate out of state, and some may not be amicable.
Yep.
Those are always fun.
Yeah, and sometimes you might hear them called like voluntarily or involuntarily. Some people like to throw in retirement. So there's different terminologies, and we've seen real robust sections. We've seen very narrow sections, but those are all, what I love about how you're saying it is that these are things that you need to concentrate on. And I'm asking you this, so if depending on the trigger, is that in fact impact the purchase price?
It can, yeah. So let me put a pin in your question for a second and say that the next thing you have to figure out is what's the value of the practice and what's the purchase price going to be, and there's a whole conversation that goes there. I mean, it could be, a process to get evaluation done that has its own pros and cons to it. It can be, and in this process to get evaluation, I know we just had the last episode with Anna Brewer, where she talked about valuing a practice. So that's one way to set it up. Another way to set it up is a little less formal with a formula to come up with the value of the purchase price. And then even sometimes you have a set number that is just here's the amount. We're predetermining the amount. All of these have pros and cons to them that you can't just be plug and played, and there needs to be a strategic conversation around it. But then that brings back your question, Brad, which is, let's just say you go get evaluation, and let's say that someone is going to get bought out for $1 million, but they're going to go across the street and compete with you. Well, it feels like a double hit, right, to the practice. They're losing revenue, they're paying the person to buy them out, and they're going to go compete with them. And so a lot of times, to your question, there will be penalties to the valuation if there are certain circumstances like that. Or you can have special provisions that deal with insurance funds that will be funding the purchase price, like our story today.
Perfect. Now that we understand, Michael, why we need them, in your thoughts, who should help develop these agreements?
Well, this is a trick question, kind of, because I've heard you say this 1,000 times. It takes a village, or in this case, a team, your team of advisors, to all be on the same page. So if you're the practice, you have the business operations people, you've got your CPAs, you've got your attorneys, and you have insurance products. You have your insurance broker, and all have to be aligned as they organize this plan.
Yeah, and this goes back to, I have said this before in other episodes, but, we always talk about the 4 C's as the tools that we use to help develop these governing documents, but that's where the 5th C come in, which is the communications between all those professionals. And in this case, that could have minimized all these conflicts and hopefully, if not completely avoided, if they had brought those professionals together.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, the conflict, the problem, let's meet the problem head on that happened here. We had different documents saying different things. What could the practice have done differently?
Well, for starters, you already did a great job of detailing a lot of the pieces with the 4 C's. and fifth being communication. But the practice in this case, they used different lawyers at different times to draft different agreements. And by siloing these attorneys and documents, the practice, unfortunately, had opened itself up to all these conflicts that we've noticed. And further, by not having the financial planner or even copies of the actual disability insurance discussed with the attorneys, everyone was blind to these conflicts.
So here's the question, Brad. What happened to Dr. Kindness in the practice?
Yeah, so as noted in the story, everyone was about to lose big time because the forms didn't match the substance in the sense of the documents did not match which the actual policies they had in place. So in this case, both the practice and Dr. Kindness were in alignment because these documents really didn't reflect their actual intent of the parties. They intended for the parties to benefit from these policies, these insurance policies. Because of this alignment, since they were in line, with lots of communications between the insurance agent, the CPAs, the practice itself, and us, we're able to eventually modify all these documents to actually detail the actual intent. And the parties were lucky in this case as we didn't have a death, as you said, one of those triggers, the what-if moments, or complete mental disability, which impaired Dr. Kindness from even making decisions. Had any of that occurred, or if the parties had not been in alignment, everyone would have lost. And, one thing I will say that turned out well because of this particular incident, the practice did have a moment in time where we were able to go in and update all documents with new disability policies, and we had everyone involved. And so the practice actually had a much better system in place now because they were luckily able to identify a weakness in what they had. But, Michael, what are some of your final thoughts?
Well, I'll just say this. Life happens.
Mm-hmm.
And, whether we're talking about the people who have had their lives turned upside down in an instant that we've met through these nonprofits that we talked about at the beginning, or friends who get the diagnosis that, they woke up that morning having no reason to think they were about to get. It does happen. And I say that because there is a tendency as it relates to this type of planning to put your head in the sand and think that happens to other people. It doesn't happen to you. And so I can't emphasize enough the impact when you're already dealing with the personal impact of a disability, of how not having stuff together on the professional side will just compound the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. All great points, Michael. And join us next Wednesday for Swiping Left on Unspoken Expectations. Thanks again for joining us today. And remember, if you like this episode, please subscribe, make sure to give us a 5-star rating, and share with your friends.
You can also sign up for the ByrdAdatto newsletter by going to our website at ByrdAdatto.com.
ByrdAdatto is providing this podcast as a public service. This podcast is for educational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute legal advice, nor does it establish an attorney-client relationship. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by ByrdAdatto. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Please consult with an attorney on your legal issues.